The story unfolds in 1864, Bavaria, where the young Ludwig II ascends to the throne amid a Europe torn between tradition and revolution, carrying the weight of a kingdom that would soon witness the most extraordinary reign in German history. The cathedral bells of Munich rang with hollow authority that March morning, their bronze voices echoing across cobblestone streets slick with melting snow. Ludwig Otto Friedrich Wilhelm, 18 years old and trembling beneath his ceremonial robes, felt the crown's weight settle upon his skull like a metal parasite. The assembled nobility watched with expectant eyes, their faces masks of calculated ambition. They had waited for this moment. These vultures in velvet, believing they could mold this shy prince into their puppet. How wrong they were. The new king's hands shook as he gripped the scepter, not from nervousness, but from a deeper tremor that would plague him throughout his reign. Already, behind those pale blue eyes, visions danced like fever dreams. Medieval knights on white stallions, swan boats gliding across moonlit lakes, and always, the thunderous crescendo of Wagner's music, drowning out the mundane chatter of court politics. The coronation ceremony dragged on with its ancient rituals, but Ludwig's mind had already fled to distant mountains, where castles of impossible beauty would one day pierce the clouds. His mother, Queen Marie, watched from the gallery with growing unease. She had noticed the signs years ago, the way her son would disappear for hours into his private theater, emerging with wild eyes and flushed cheeks, speaking in fragments of operatic verse. The boy who should have been learning statecraft was instead memorizing the librettos of mythical heroes. When courtiers approached with matters of taxation or military strategy, Ludwig would turn away with visible disgust, as if their words were insects buzzing around his ears. The first months of his reign passed in a haze of confusion and mounting dread among the Bavarian ministers. Ludwig refused to attend council meetings, instead spending his days reading poetry in the palace gardens or composing lengthy letters to composers and artists across Europe. When forced to sign documents, he would do so with theatrical flourishes, sometimes adding his own marginalia in the form of musical notes or sketches of fantastical architecture. The government machinery ground on without him, powered by bureaucratic momentum and the increasingly desperate efforts of his ministers to maintain the illusion of royal authority. It was during this period that Ludwig first encountered the music of Richard Wagner, a meeting that would prove catastrophic for Bavaria's treasury and the king's tenuous grip on reality. The composer's revolutionary operas, with their themes of doomed love and mythological grandeur, struck Ludwig like lightning to his already overwrought nervous system. Here was a man who understood that art was not mere entertainment, but a sacred calling, a pathway to transcendence that mere mortals could barely comprehend. Ludwig began flooding Wagner with gold, commissioning private performances and funding grandiose productions that left audiences either rapturous or bewildered. The transformation was swift and terrible to behold. Ludwig's appetite for food diminished, while his hunger for beauty became insatiable. He would fast for days, then gorge himself on elaborate meals, served in solitude while orchestras played in hidden alcoves. Servants whispered of finding him at dawn, still dressed in evening clothes, conducting invisible symphonies in empty ballrooms. His correspondence with Wagner took on an almost religious fervor, filled with declarations of eternal devotion that made even the composer uncomfortable. The letters grew longer and more rambling, their handwriting deteriorating into barely legible scrawls as Ludwig's mental state continued its inexorable decline. The building of Neuschwanstein began as a modest project, a summer retreat in the Bavarian Alps where the king could escape the suffocating atmosphere of Munich. But like everything Ludwig touched, the castle quickly evolved into something monstrous in its ambition. Architects were dismissed when they suggested practical concerns like structural integrity or realistic budgets. Ludwig wanted towers that scraped the heavens, halls that could accommodate entire orchestras, and rooms decorated with scenes from Germanic mythology. The construction site became a theater of absurdity, with workers laboring through harsh winters to install elaborate murals depicting swan knights and grail quests, while the kingdom's coffers emptied at an alarming rate. As the years passed, Ludwig's nocturnal wanderings became legendary among the local peasantry. They would glimpse his sleigh racing through moonlit forests, pulled by white horses and accompanied by servants dressed as medieval pages. The king would emerge from these midnight journeys with frost in his beard and madness in his eyes, speaking of conversations with the ghost of Marie Antoinette, or claiming to have witnessed the wild hunt crossing the Alpine peaks. His appearance grew increasingly haggard, his once handsome features gaunt and hollow-eyed, as if the weight of his fantasies was physically consuming him from within. The court physicians, when they were permitted to examine him, found a man caught between worlds. Ludwig's pulse would race when discussing his architectural projects, his hands gesturing wildly as he described rooms that existed only in his imagination. But when confronted with matters of state, he would withdraw into catatonic silence, his body rigid with what appeared to be physical revulsion. Dr. Bernhard von Gutton, the kingdom's most respected alienist, began compiling a dossier of behaviors that would later be used to justify the king's removal from power. The irony was not lost on those who understood Ludwig's true nature. Here was a man being declared insane for refusing to participate in the collective madness of politics and war. The breaking point came during the winter of 1885, when Ludwig's behavior reached new heights of bizarre extravagance. He commissioned a replica of the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, complete with hundreds of candles that were lit every night, whether he was present or not. The waste was staggering, but Ludwig insisted that the beauty of the illuminated hall was worth any cost. He began hosting dinner parties for imaginary guests, complete with full table settings and elaborate meals that went uneaten, while he conversed with empty chairs about philosophy and art. Servants were instructed to change the bed linens in unused guest rooms daily, in case the spirits of long dead royalty decided to visit. The final months of Ludwig's reign were a descent into a madness that was both pitiable and magnificent. He rarely left his chambers during daylight hours, emerging only after sunset to wander his increasingly fantastical residences. Construction on his various castle projects continued at a frenzied pace, funded by loans that Bavaria could never hope to repay. The king's weight fluctuated wildly as he alternated between periods of ravenous appetite and complete abstinence from food. His teeth began to rot from the exotic sweets he consumed in vast quantities, giving his smile a gullish quality that terrified even his most loyal attendants. The conspiracy to remove Ludwig from power was orchestrated with clinical precision by men who saw his artistic vision as nothing more than expensive delusion. Baron von Lotz, the kingdom's finance minister, worked in concert with Dr. von Gudden to build a case for the king's mental incompetence. They compiled testimonies from servants, analyzed his increasingly erratic correspondence, and documented his refusal to engage with governmental duties. The medical evaluation that condemned Ludwig was conducted entirely in absentia, a farce that violated every principle of psychiatric practice, but served the political necessity of the moment. On June 9, 1886, Ludwig was declared mentally unfit to rule and placed under medical supervision at Berg Castle. The man who had dreamed of transcending earthly concerns found himself trapped in a lakeside prison, guarded by alienists who viewed his aesthetic sensibilities as symptoms of disease. For 3 days, he paced the corridors like a caged animal, his once elaborate clothing replaced by simple patient garments. The transformation was complete. The fairy tale king had become just another madman in a world that had no patience for beautiful impossibilities. The circumstances of Ludwig's death remain shrouded in mystery that grows more impenetrable with each passing year. On the evening of June 13, he was found floating in Lake Starnberg alongside Dos von Gudden, both men apparently drowned under conditions that made little sense to investigators. The official verdict of suicide satisfied no one, least of all those who understood that Ludwig, despite his many eccentricities, had never shown any inclination towards self-destruction. More likely, they whispered, was that the king had finally attempted to escape his captors, only to meet his end in the dark waters that had long featured in his romantic fantasies. The autopsy revealed a man prematurely aged by his obsessions, his organs showing the wear of extreme emotional stress and irregular eating habits. But there were no signs of the hereditary madness that his enemies had claimed motivated his removal from power. Instead, the physicians found the body of someone who had quite literally died of a broken heart, his cardiovascular system weakened by years of living in a state of perpetual artistic ecstasy and political despair. The final irony was that Ludwig's death came just as his greatest creation, Neuschwanstein, neared completion, as if he had been permitted to live only long enough to see his vision made manifest. In the aftermath of Ludwig's death, Bavaria discovered the true extent of his financial legacy. The kingdom teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, its coffers emptied by decades of architectural excess and artistic patronage. Yet even as the accountants tallied the staggering debts, something unexpected began to happen. Visitors from across Europe started arriving in Bavaria, drawn by stories of the Mad King's fairy tale castles. What had been viewed as monuments to royal insanity gradually transformed into symbols of romantic imagination, their beauty transcending the practical concerns that had motivated Ludwig's enemies. The irony would have delighted the dead king had he lived to witness it. Neuschwanstein, the castle that had bankrupted his kingdom and contributed to his downfall, began generating revenues that dwarfed its construction costs within a generation. Tourists flocked to experience the romantic vision that Ludwig had literally died to create, their admission fees eventually paying off the debts that had seemed insurmountable. The Mad King's folly had become Bavaria's greatest asset, proving that sometimes the dreams of madmen are more valuable than the schemes of rational politicians. But the true measure of Ludwig's legacy lies not in tourist revenue or architectural achievement, but in the questions his life continues to pose about the nature of sanity and the price of beauty. In an age increasingly dominated by industrial pragmatism and political calculation, Ludwig had dared to live as if aesthetic considerations were more important than economic ones. His castles were not mere buildings but three-dimensional poems, attempts to make the transcendent tangible in a world that preferred its transcendence safely confined to Sunday sermons and opera houses. The medical establishment that had condemned Ludwig as insane would later be forced to confront the possibility that they had pathologized vision itself. Modern psychiatry recognizes that many of the behaviors cited as evidence of the king's madness, his social withdrawal, his artistic obsessions, his difficulty with interpersonal relationships, might today be understood as manifestations of high-functioning autism or extreme artistic sensitivity rather than clinical insanity. The tragedy of Ludwig's story lies not in his supposed mental illness, but in a society's inability to accommodate genius that expressed itself in ways that challenge conventional expectations of royal behavior. The peasants who had witnessed Ludwig's midnight sleigh rides through the alpine forests preserved stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. They spoke of a king who could communicate with animals, who could command the northern lights to dance above his castle towers, who had been visited by the spirits of legendary heroes, seeking his counsel on matters of honor and beauty. These tales, dismissed by rational minds as folklore, captured something essential about Ludwig's true nature that clinical diagnosis had missed entirely. In his private journals, discovered decades after his death, Ludwig had written extensively about his sense of displacement in time, his feeling that he had been born into the wrong century. He longed for an age when kings were expected to be patrons of beauty rather than administrators of bureaucracy, when the pursuit of the sublime was considered a legitimate royal preoccupation. His tragedy was not madness, but temporal displacement. The curse of a medieval soul trapped in a modern body, expected to function according to rules that violated his deepest nature. The question that haunts Bavaria to this day is whether Ludwig's removal from power was an act of political necessity or cultural vandalism. Certainly, his spending had become unsustainable. His neglect of governmental duties potentially dangerous to the kingdom's stability. But the methods used to depose him, the psychiatric evaluation conducted without his presence, the mysterious circumstances of his death, all suggest a conspiracy motivated more by fear of his unconventional vision than genuine concern for his welfare or the kingdom's future.